All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the IPR Monday Colloquium. We're very fortunate to have Robin Nusslock with us today. As many of you know, Robin is an associate professor in psychology and a faculty fellow in the Institute for Policy Research. Robin's research for the past decade is focused on the brain's reward systems and how they function in everyday life. And how they go awry in mental illnesses like bipolar disorder and major depression. Over the past few years, he's extended this research into the domain of health inequities and disparities and become an invaluable member of the C2S group, really helping us to understand how context and experience influence the brain and how that in turn might contribute to disproportionate negative health outcomes. He's become much more interested in policies and in programs that can reduce health inequities and become just a great member of our team. I think you'll find his work very exciting. He's an amazing researcher and an outstanding teacher. I'm going to just go ahead and let him take the rest of the time. If you have questions about clarification, feel free to put them in the Q&A and I'll ask him during the talk. Otherwise, save more substantive questions till the end and we can have a discussion. With that, take it away.
Thank you so much, Greg. Okay, can people see my, Patricia, you can see it?
Yeah, excellent.
Okay. Well, it's just a pleasure to be here and thank you so much to Greg for introducing me and just provide a little bit of context. As Greg alluded to, I'm trained as a neuroscientist and particularly with a focus on human brain imaging. And historically, my laboratory has used the tools of functional and structural MRI, which I'm going to move this thing out of the way. Structural and functional MRI, which is this machine right here, which allows us to examine the structure as well as the function of the brain. And again, historically, my research has been particularly interested in what brain systems create risk for mental illnesses with a focus on depression and anxiety and addiction. And we've been very interested in what internal mechanisms generate risk for anxiety and depression and various psychiatric states by focusing on MRI as a way of studying brain systems and probing these brain systems. But more recently, I've really noticed my interest in my career be complemented with a strong transition from what are the internal risk factors to what are the external risk factors? What are things in the environment that can affect the brain and create risk for mental and physical health? And I will say this is largely and primarily been inspired by all of you and my affiliation with IPR. IPR really has broadened the scope of my focus and my interest to really appreciate the dynamic exchange between the person and the society, the cells to society. And also this has been really, strongly influenced by some very dear friendships with Edith and Greg. And I run with Greg multiple times per week. And through our conversations, we started to appreciate some of the real intersections of our work. And this really has expanded kind of my mid-career focus into a series of questions that will be the theme for today's conversation. The first theme will be the question, the kind of defining theme of this talk will be the question of how is it that adversity out in the environment actually gets underneath the skin to affect our physical and mental health? And I know many people in this, in IPR and the room in general are interested in health disparities or income disparities and various things like that. And so the question that I want to complement to that work is how might that actually embed itself in our biology and in our brains to generate risk for mental and physical health? Related to that is Tom McDade uses this phrase and I always love it. How is it that our life experiences, our environments, the things that we are exposed to in our life, how does that actually become our biology? How does that leave a footprint on our genome, on our brains, on our immune cells, and on our health? And then more kind of focally, how is it that adversity and adversity that people are exposed to, how is it that creates a risk for a broad set of mental and physical health problems? Rather than just one particular mental or physical health problem, there's compelling evidence that early life adversity in particular is associated with risk for a number of mental and physical health problems? And how is it that our understanding of the intersection between the body and the environment can help inform our understanding of that question? So just to kind of set the foundation for the talk, as many of you know, there are significant health disparities in the United States. And life adversity, and particularly poverty, is associated with a number of mental and physical health disparities across the lifespan. And what's interesting is that early adversity, that very early period of development, may be particularly important for generating risk for both mental and physical health problems. And this is probably driven by the fact that our bodies and our brains are highly malleable, or what's called plastic or plasticity in biology. During the early stages of life, they're creating their set points, their sensitivity points. And that may be a period of time in which adversity is particularly impactful on our risk for mental and physical health problems, and also may, by the flip side, may be a period of time where there's important inroads for intervention. I just want to show you some data to establish the fact that health disparities exist. This is a study here that's looking at individuals who are at the age of 25 who grew up in poverty. And I want to first bring your attention to the blue line, which is basically individuals who are living in poverty. This indicates the percent at the federal poverty line. And as you can see, across all levels, individuals at the blue line or who are living at below the poverty level have a lower life expectancy. So poverty really does, in a sense, lead to a shorter life expectancy. And this is particularly true for Black individuals who are living in poverty. So there seems to be a particularly strong health disparity effect on individuals who are poor, but particularly Black individuals who are poor. This health disparity appears to be present from the earliest stages of life. So babies that are born to mothers who have less than a high school education, you can see here that they're more likely to have a neonatal mortality or to die very early on. And the infant mortality rates also are high for babies who are born to mothers who don't have a high school education. And you can see that, again, relative to college grads and other metrics of poverty, these individuals are much more likely to give birth to somebody, or to a child who's likely to die. This continues through childhood and adolescence. So if you look at the obesity rates of 10 to 17-year-olds who are living at below the poverty line, you can see that more individuals are obese. And obesity, even in kids, is a huge risk factor for a number of mental and physical health outcomes. And I'll talk about this in more detail. Just another slide at this particular time period. We can see that individuals who are growing up in poverty between the ages of 10 and 17 have higher rates of atherosclerosis. And atherosclerosis is the hardening of the arteries and is one of the primary mechanisms that generates risk for coronary heart disease and heart attacks at a later point in life. So in adolescence, growing up in poverty also is having an effect, and these effects are lingering from early adversity. And finally, the effects of early life adversity on health stretch into adulthood. So this is on the x-axis here, we have age. On the y-axis, we have morbidity. And what you can see is that individuals who are adults and who grew up in early childhood adversity, again, are more likely to die earlier as a result of that experience of growing up in early childhood SCS, even equating for their adult SCS. So the effect of growing up in early adversity has a prolonged effect on people's health and their likelihood of mortality. The last point I want to make here is the fact that early adversity generates kind of age-appropriate illnesses. So early adversity will result often in asthma and respiratory infections in the earlier stages of life. Then when the individuals who are exposed to early adversity are in adolescence, you see the onset of psychiatric conditions like depression, substance misuse, obesity, as well as some preclinical conditions of coronary heart disease like insulin resistance and atherosclerosis. And then this translates into later health problems that can create mortality, such as strokes and metabolic syndromes, coronary heart diseases, etc. And so again, the kind of unifying theme of this particular talk is how is it that this adversity, how is it that this stress, how is it that this early exposure to stress actually, oops, sorry for the spelling here, generates, gets under the skin to generate a heterogeneous set of mental and physical health problems. So it's not just generating one set of health problems, it's generating a heterogeneous set of mental and physical health problems. Now, historically, research has typically focused on single diseases or single organ systems, but we suggest that to really understand how early adversity can generate such a broad risk of mental and physical health problems, it's important to take a multi-organ perspective, to move beyond just single disease systems or single organ systems. And we'd also suggest that if you're going to take a multi-organ perspective, understanding the signaling between the brain and the immune system may be particularly helpful, because there are important bidirectional relationships between the brain and the immune system that appear to have very important implications for understanding risks for both mental and physical health. And so this talk will really take a neuroimmune perspective to understanding how stress embeds itself in our biology to generate risk for these health disparities. Just to give you a roadmap for today's talk, the first theme that I'll be talking about is a neuroimmune network model that Greg Miller and I developed to understand this question of how stress gets underneath the skin. I'll be focusing particularly on early life adversity with a particular focus on poverty. But what's interesting is that even though I'll be focusing on poverty, this research is generalizable to many other forms of mental and physical illness, and or many other forms of early adversity, as it seems that different types of early adversity, in some respects, albeit with nuances, can have a comparable outcome on people's lives. So it may converge along a general kind of pathway of multiple different types of early adversity may create health problems through similar mechanisms. I'd then like to focus a bit on, well, not only how do people get sick, but also what are systems in our brains and bodies that may facilitate resiliency to stress-related health problems? That what are the mechanisms in our brains and bodies that may help protect us from exposure or from the health consequences of stress? And then related to that, discuss some intervention and policy implications that this research may facilitate. The anchor for this talk is a paper that Greg Miller and I wrote a few years ago, which again is centering on this theme of how is it that early adversity gets underneath the skin to affect our risk for mental and physical health problems. Here is a figure from that paper. It's a complex figure, so I want to try to make it as simple as possible. So if early adversity generates risk for a host of problems, what is the first inroad, or what is a inroad into how that may actually translate into our bodies and impact our health? And I first want to bring your attention to a particular area of the brain called the amygdala. Many of you may have heard of the amygdala. The amygdala is, you could think of the amygdala as the brain's fire alarm. When there's something happening in the environment that is stressful, that is anxiety provoking, that suggests to us that we need to be prepared, the amygdala becomes active. The amygdala, from my perspective, you could think of as like a vigilance system. It's generating a heightened state of threat processing, a heightened state of vigilance. And corresponding with that is it's also associated with elevated states of fear. Both animal and human research has suggested that stress, and particularly early life adversity, is associated with not only functional alterations to the amygdala, but actually structural alterations to the amygdala. And importantly, these alterations appear to persist into adulthood. I just want to give you one proof of concept study of why this may actually occur. This is a study by Seth Pollack at the University of Wisconsin. And what you see here is a part of the experiment that he did, in which he showed individuals to pictures. And these pictures started off as very pixelated. You can see on the left side here, they were basically uninterpretable, and they're pictures of faces. And then if he showed progressively more and more detail on the face, going from the left to the right here, so that eventually people could tell what facial expression people were making. So people knew they were looking at faces, but their goal in this task was to, as soon as possible, press a button to indicate that they knew what particular facial expression was on the computer screen. And then what he did is he looked at people who had a history of maltreatment, of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, compared to individuals with no maltreatment. And what we have here is the dissolve to full. So this is basically where the image is uninterpretable. This is where the image is fully clear. And the red line are individuals with a history of maltreatment. The blue line are a history of individuals with no maltreatment. And here what we're plotting, or what Seth is plotting, is basically the rate with which they're able to determine what the facial expression is. And you can see that individuals with a history of maltreatment versus no maltreatment are comparably good at determining when a happy face presents itself. But the individuals with a history of maltreatment are actually faster at accurately determining when it's an angry face. Because, you know, if you're growing up in an abusive environment, picking up cues of anger are really important for survival mechanisms. And this has been related to heightened amygdala activation. So in a sense, there's a certain adaptiveness to having heightened threat processing when living in early adversity. In a parallel body of research, there's growing evidence that early adversity also sensitizes the immune system and creates a heightened state of inflammation in the periphery. So we're moving from the brain to the body here. And just to kind of orient you to what we're talking, we'll be focusing particularly in this conversation on inflammation. And inflammation is a highly adaptive mechanism. We'd all have serious problems if we didn't have an inflammatory response. It's one of the first responses of the immune system to irritation and infection. It's stimulated by chemical factors. You'll be hearing this term a fair amount today, pro-inflammatory cytokines. These are molecules or proteins that are designed to facilitate a heightened inflammatory response. So for today's talk, you could think of cytokines as essentially reflecting high inflammation. And this is facilitating tissue repair and clearance of pathogens, exposure. This is obviously, again, highly adaptive when regulated, but when chronic, inflammation, under conditions of chronic inflammation, has been associated with a number of mental and physical health problems. And I just want to point you to the fact that these mental and physical health problems are the same health problems that are associated with early adversity. So this suggests that inflammation may be a mechanism by which early adversity is generating a host of risks in the brain and body associated with exposure to early stress. One of the things that's apparent also is that this early disadvantage lingers into adulthood in the immune system. This is a fairly complicated finding from, or complicated figure from Greg's study in PNAS a few years ago. I just want to make it very simple. This is showing that young adulthood, so if you grow up in early poverty, when you're an adult, you actually show continued inflammation. So on this, or the y-axis here, what we have here is IL-6, that's a pro-inflammatory cytokine. So more values here equal more inflammation. And on the x-axis here, we have socioeconomic status. And this is early life socioeconomic status. And what you can see here is that individuals who are young adults, but who grew up in early childhood with high adversity actually have heightened inflammation. And this is also, don't worry about the terms here, I just want to make the point that this is not only reflective in the actual levels of these inflammatory molecules, but it's also observable at the level of gene expression. So these are mechanisms of gene expression associated with increased inflammation. And the point I'm trying to make here is that early life adversity is associated with increased inflammation, both at the level of these inflammatory molecules, but it also embeds itself in our genome in a way that kind of is associated with increased inflammation. Now, there are well-established mechanisms by which early adversity could affect the immune system. So we have, if you kind of tell thus far, I'm talking about two parallel stories. One is early adversity affects the brain. One is early adversity affects the immune system. But we know quite well how this happens. And one way that it happens is via the brain. So under conditions of stress, I've discussed how early adversity accentuates cells in the amygdala to be hyper-responsive to threat. These cells then facilitate what's called sympathetic outflow. So they activate a part of the nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system. You could think of the sympathetic nervous system as the part of the nervous system that leaves the brain, that goes into the body, that helps you prepare for threats. Okay, it's the part of the nervous system that leaves the brain and that goes into the body and activates your body to prepare to threaten things in your world. It's associated with increased heart rate, it's associated with increased blood pressure, it's associated with increased respiration, all things to help you run away from predators and find places of safety. What's interesting is that the molecule that the sympathetic nervous system releases is a molecule called norepinephrine. So this is a stimulatory molecule that's designed to create a stress response in our bodies. The sympathetic nervous system actually synapses or connects onto immune cells in regions like the bone marrow and releases norepinephrine onto these developing immune cells and actually facilitates an increased inflammatory response. So I just want to highlight the fact that there's a strong connection between the amygdala and the immune system. And so if the brain is in a state of defense, it wants the body to be in a state of defense as well, and it facilitates this heightened inflammatory response. And there's also mechanisms via the HPA axis, i.e. cortisol, that I'm not going to discuss right now, but both of these systems are designed to facilitate heightened inflammation. Now, this is a fairly clear path. Many of you have heard about mind-body medicine. You know that the mind can affect the body. You know that the brain can affect the immune system. What's more intriguing, or equally intriguing to me, is that there's actually, this is a two-road street. This is a bidirectional pathway. The crosstalk goes in both directions. There's growing evidence to suggest that inflammation in the body can actually access the brain. It can access the brain through multiple mechanisms. And so these pro-inflammatory cytokines that I've been discussing, which are kind of the primary immune molecule that we'll be focusing on today, they can access the brain. They can access through leaky portions of the brain and the blood-brain barrier. They can bind to a nerve called the vagus nerve and facilitate the release of cytokines in the brain. There's multiple mechanisms by which inflammation can actually access or modulate brain activity. There's some growing evidence that these cells called classical monocytes, which are really a primary generator of these cytokines, are not only passively going to the brain, but they may be actively recruited by stress-reactive brain regions. So the brain may be actually actively signaling to the immune system, hey, I need you to come. I need you to facilitate some activity in the brain. And this suggests that the brain and the immune system are in this really dynamic conversation with each other. And increases in increases in inflammation have actually been shown to modulate the very brain region that we've been talking about, the amygdala, and actually increase anxiety and depressive behaviors in rodents. Let me give you an example of this in humans. So this is a study by Tristan Inagaki in which she actually injected, these are human participants now, she injected human participants with an endotoxin. I think it was lipopolysaccharide, which is basically a bacteria that facilitates a pro-inflammatory response in the body. So people came into the lab, they were injected with endotoxin, this molecule that increased inflammation. And then she put individuals into an MRI scanner. If you've ever had an MRI scanner, you know you're kind of laid down in this bed, you're pushed into the MRI scanner. We can use MRIs on the knees, we can use it on the elbows, but we can also use it on the brain. And what she did is while she was while people were exposed to this endotoxin, she studied people's brain responses to fearful faces. And fearful faces are a good provoker of threat and amygdala activation, because in our evolutionary history, if you look at a fearful face, that suggests there's something threatening in the environment and you need to be ready to respond to it. And she studied the amygdala. And what she found is that individuals who were exposed to this endotoxin actually had increased inflammatory signaling in the amygdala relative to those who were exposed to a placebo, again, suggesting that increasing inflammation in the body may increase threat-related neural activity in the brain. Now, again, this is highly adaptive in the short term. These systems evolve to facilitate kind of moment-to-moment signaling. But under conditions of chronic threat responding and chronic inflammation, this may become maladaptive and generate risk for the host of mental and physical problems that I discussed earlier. A second target of inflammation from the body into the brain is a brain region that you may not be that familiar with, but I'll try to make it simple for you. You could think of the amygdala as the brain's brake pedal. So if the amygdala is halting activity and kind of creating a fear response, this next brain region, you could think of the brain's accelerator or the brain's gas pedal. This is the part of your brain that's designed to get you to go towards things. You could think of a lot of our life decisions is about, do I stay or do I go? The amygdala is stay and freeze. The ventral striatum is about going and approaching. And why would inflammation target the ventral striatum? Well, what's intriguing is that one of the very first symptoms that we all have when we're sick are these sickness behaviors. You feel maybe a sense of malaise, you feel a sense of demotivation, maybe a little anhedonia, things that typically bring you pleasure don't bring you pleasure anymore. It turns out that inflammation is designed to actually shut down reward signaling in the ventral striatum, because when we're sick, it's highly adaptive to conserve our metabolic resources to fighting off pathogens and facilitating wound healing, rather than going off and running marathons or skiing or other types of things. So inflammation is designed to actually cause you to stop and pause and heal, etc. Just to give you another proof of concept here, this is another study. This is by Naomi Eisenberger. If you give people the same endotoxin, you put people into an MRI scanner, but here instead of showing people scary faces, you show them pictures of rewards like money or other types of rewards, and you study the ventral striatum, this reward region of the brain. What you find is that whereas inflammation accentuated or increased amygdala activity, it actually lowers reward-related brain function. So inflammation seems to be creating a profile of heightened threat and low reward-related brain function. Just to show you, this is the ventral striatal activity. These are people who are exposed to an endotoxin. These are people who are exposed to a placebo, and you can see that the inflammation lowers reward-related brain function. Just for those of you who are interested, it appears to be dopamine, the neurotransmitter, appears to be the primary target here, and inflammation appears to be attenuating dopamine signaling. Again, highly adaptive in the short term, but under conditions of chronic low reward-related brain function or chronic inflammation, this may create problems. The final brain region that I'll talk about here is the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is the third part of our conversation of the brain. We've had the amygdala, the ventral striatum, the prefrontal cortex. You could think of the prefrontal cortex as your brain's executive system. This is the part of the brain that helps you do the hard thing when it's the right thing to do. This is the part of the brain that delays gratification, that does long-term goals, that does planning, that makes you think about things in the future rather than just thinking about things in the present. It's involved in working memory, certain kind of higher order emotions. And there's compelling evidence that inflammation, when chronic, can actually affect the structure and function of the prefrontal cortex. This is a study that we did with Greg and Edith, just to show you examining the relationship between peripheral inflammation in the body and the brain's central executive network. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this prefrontal process, so I want to introduce you to the brain central executive network. You could think of the brain central executive network as essentially, again, this kind of, executive control system. It's anchored in the prefrontal cortex, which is basically right here. So the hub of the executive network in our brain is the prefrontal cortex, but it also has a broad set of connections to other portions of the brain that facilitate coordinated executive functioning. And it really supports the regulation of our emotions. We all have emotions, we all have thoughts, but one of the important things that we do is we regulate those thoughts and emotions. We say, all right, too much, too little, maintain. We kind of talk to ourselves. One of the things that we do when we talk to ourselves is we may reappraise stressful situations. So we've all had stressors in our life. You could think of reappraisal as basically you talking to yourself in a way that talks down the negative and accentuates the positive. And it's also been associated with the suppression of threats. And so the central executive network is really helpful for us managing stress. So in this study, we put people into an MRI scanner. These were 82 youth from urban Chicago. Greg was the PI of the grant. My lab did all of the brain imaging. And so we were able to combine our respective resources and look at inflammatory molecules and brain scans. And this just shows you the correlation here on the x-axis here. We have the central executive network. On the y-axis, we have inflammation. As you can see, as inflammation goes up, the strength of the brain's prefrontal kind of regulatory system actually goes down. And this is also observed for another set of molecules or cells, in this case called classical monocytes, which are particularly important for inflammation. As inflammation goes up, the central executive system, its strength goes down, again, suggesting that inflammation is weakening the prefrontal system. If you put these results together, what we find is that inflammation in the body is actually elevating risk for a profile of brain activity that's very common in things like depression and anxiety. We have heightened threat neural activity. So inflammation is accentuating threat neural activity. Inflammation is lowering our brain's reward system, and inflammation is also lowering our brain's prefrontal system. And just to kind of show you some data to back this up, this is a meta-analysis of the neural activity in depression. I'll just point you to the fact that the very brain regions that inflammation targets are very central brain regions that are involved in the onset of depression. And so what inflammation in the body seems to be doing is creating a sense of dysphoria or negative emotions in the brain. What do we do when we feel negative emotions? Well, we go out and we try to regulate those emotions. And sometimes we engage in non-optimal ways of regulating those emotions. We might go out and drink, people might eat high-fat foods, people might smoke cigarettes, people might do drugs, people might do a lot of behaviors or these kind of risky behaviors that are associated with increasing inflammation and actually accentuating inflammation. I just want to show you a study to kind of demonstrate how this might happen. This is a study that we did in which we brought people into our laboratory and we examined their brain, and then we followed them for a period of 2 years. And our question was whether we could use people's neural activity in this reward system, the ventral striatum that you've now heard of, to actually predict who goes on to develop an addictive profile of behavior over the next 2 years. And the reward hyposensitivity model of addiction suggests that decreased activity in the brain's reward system is actually a risk factor for going out and developing addictive behaviors, because people with low positive emotions will often seek outside of themselves what they're lacking on the inside and engage in excessive addictive behaviors. So this was a study with 110 subjects. This is a study from my lab. People did an fMRI scan, and we looked at this ventral striatal activation to reward cues. And I just kind of show you one or two quick figures from this. What we find is that people with low reward-related brain function, this profile of brain activity that the inflammatory can create, is actually associated with increased alcohol and drug use, and it's associated with increased problematic alcohol and drug use. So again, low reward-related brain function can facilitate high-risk pro-inflammatory behaviors. So if we put this together, what we find is this positive feedback loop between the brain and the body, this positive feedback loop between the brain, the emotional brain, and the peripheral inflammatory signaling, which can, over time, you could think of as like each of these abnormal, or each of these kind of issues, like throwing kerosene onto a log and the fire just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And what we suggest is that the dysregulation of this system can really put people at risk for a host of mental and physical health problems. So I've kind of discussed with you the mechanisms by which stress gets underneath our skin by affecting neuroimmune signaling. What I'd now like to spend some time on is saying what might help protect people from these neuroimmune dysregulations or these neuroimmune problems that create a host of mental and physical health problems. And so I'm going to be discussing certain brain systems that may actually protect people, that generate resiliency to stress-related health problems as a result of being exposed to early adversity like poverty or exposure to violence, etc. So I mentioned to you earlier that poverty is associated with high levels of inflammation. So this is another study showing that people who are living in or growing up in low socioeconomic status, these are adults, just again highlighting the fact that this stays throughout adulthood. But if you grow up in early life adversity, in this case poverty, you have heightened inflammation relative to individuals who are living in high socioeconomic status. But what I also want to highlight here is the fact that there's significant variability. Not everyone who grows up in poverty is having high inflammation. Not everyone who grows up in poverty is having a host of physical health problems down the road. There's significant variation. And again, what we're interested in here is what might predict why somebody's down at this end of the scale as opposed to this particular end of the scale. Bruce McEwen wrote a wonderful paper on this in the New England Journal of Medicine some years ago. And he said that one of the things that really is important for understanding whether somebody's at risk or resiliency in response to stress are their threat brain systems. They're, in this case, the amygdala that we've talked about. And so we wanted to examine this. This was, again, from Greg was the PI in this particular grant. My lab did the brain imaging. His lab did the blood work. And this is a study looking at the extent to which people's amygdala may actually moderate or affect moderate the effect of early adversity on their inflammation. So in this study, 207 youth from urban Chicago had their blood drawn and also did a brain scan. They completed a phases paradigm. The phases paradigm, again, was designed to assess threat activity. The phases appear to be impactful for activating this brain area called the amygdala. And what we then did is we we binned people, we broke people up into different groups depending on their amygdala activity in response to these threatening faces. Some people had fairly low activity, some people had average activity, and some people had really high reactivity to these threatening faces. And our prediction, it was that people who had high amygdala activity would be particularly affected by early adversity. So on the axis here, on the x-axis, what you see is household income to poverty. And these would be people who are really living in poverty at the time of the brain scan and the blood draw. On the vertical axis, we have low-grade inflammation. I just want to highlight first here that if you're living in a fairly wealthy environment, your amygdala activity has essentially no effect on your inflammatory response. You can have a high amygdala and a high threat processing and still respond quite well to stressful situations. If you have low amygdala reactivity, you're largely unaffected by poverty in this situation. But if you're in a situation in which you have high amygdala reactivity plus poverty, you have really high levels of inflammation. And again, this is what's particularly been associated with risk for a series of mental and physical health problems. So it's the combination of high threat processing plus poverty that appears to really be driving elevated inflammation. You might say, well, what's actually affecting the amygdala? What's driving the amygdala? Why might these individuals have high amygdala activity? Well, I'd like to kind of revisit another brain process that we discussed, the central executive network. It turns out that there's a lot of coupling between the prefrontal cortex and the subcortex of the brain. How people think about things affects their emotions. And this isn't just psychology, this is well-established biology. There is a functional and structural coupling between the thought portions of our brain and the emotion portions of our brain. And so one of the things we hypothesize is that maybe the ways in which people think about their world might actually also serve as a resiliency target in response to stress. So the kind of theme that we test here is the extent to which the central executive network might actually protect youth against heightened inflammation associated. And in this situation, instead of studying just poverty, we're focusing on neighborhood violence. So youth who are exposed to neighborhood violence, so this you could think of as vicarious violence. This isn't necessarily violence to the self. This is being exposed to violence just by living in a violent neighborhood, have heightened inflammation and increased risk for a number of inflammatory mediated illnesses. And so what we predicted is that high central executive network activity in the brain, high kind of mechanisms associated with adaptive and resilient thinking would actually protect children from the inflammatory consequences or the heightened inflammation of living in a neighborhood exposed to high levels of violence. And there were 218 urban youth in the study. This is the same study I mentioned earlier where Greg was the principal investigator on the grant. My lab did the brain imaging, 10-minute brain scan, and a blood draw. And in this particular study, the cytokines, these inflammatory molecules, were measured after innate immune cells were exposed to stimulators. So this is a figure from Greg's lab in which he did geocoding to actually look at the distribution of participants in their exposure to violence. So each one of these black dots here is actually a participant in the study. You can see there's a good distribution of participants all over Chicago. Cool colors on this map, blue, represent places that with fairly low violence or violence that reflects the kind of mean level of violence in the city of Chicago. Hot colors here, by contrast, reflect very high levels of violence. And this gives us a lot of variation in terms of exposure to violence to study the effect of the central executive network as a resiliency factor. Like the amygdala, we then binned people up into whether or not they had high versus low central executive network activity. So high here would be people with kind of strong prefrontal strength. So this is the opposite of the amygdala. High values here are good. You want to have high kind of central executive network strength. By contrast, lower values may be associated with risk. And in line with that, what we found is that, again, here on the x-axis, you have neighborhood homicide frequency, higher values relative to lower values. And on the y-axis here, you have cytokine release. I'll just highlight the fact that if you're living in a low violent neighborhood and you're not exposed to violence, your central executive network strength has minimal to no effect on your inflammatory response. Similarly, if you have high central executive network strength in your prefrontal cortex, you're largely unaffected by stress. But if you are exposed to high levels of violence, vicarious violence, i.e. murder in this case in your neighborhood, and you have weak prefrontal strength in the prefrontal cortex, you may be associated or maybe at risk with higher levels of inflammation. I just want to also discuss how might this actually translate to health, instead of just discussing this kind of as respect to inflammation, which we know is a risk factor of a number of mental and physical health problems. Let's actually look at how this might translate into some actual metrics that we know are associated with risk for health. And so I'm going to make a link here between immune signaling and risk for cardiovascular disease. We know that chronic inflammation is associated with the onset of cardiovascular disease. And in fact, cardiovascular disease may be the endpoint of chronic low-grade inflammation. A nice paper by Twackle and colleagues at Lancet really do a nice job of laying this out. This is kind of a synopsis of our neuroimmune network model. I just want to point the fact that when the amygdala is in a state of stress, it synapses onto developing cells in the bone marrow, classical monocytes, and creates this heightened state of inflammation. I've already talked about this. When chronic, this heightened state of inflammation can embed itself in the arterial lining of our heart and create atherosclerosis. And it's this atherosclerosis that appears to be a particular mechanism for risk associated with heart attacks. So what we in Twackle and others would suggest is that if you're walking around with chronically high levels of stress in your brain, you're going to be at increased risk for a heart attack. And the mechanism by which this would happen should be through your immune system. So what Twackle here did is he followed people for a number of years and he classified people based on whether or not they had cardiovascular disease onset. So he scanned people at the beginning, they didn't have a cardiovascular disease, and he followed them for a number of years and they had cardiovascular disease. I'm sorry, some people did and some people didn't. So he binned people into whether they did or they didn't. Here are the brains of people who did not have a cardiovascular disease. Here are the brain of people who went on to develop a cardiovascular disease. This is a fairly complex slide. This is using an image technique called PET imaging. It's slightly different than what I've been presenting. I just want to highlight the fact that people who went on to have a cardiovascular disease actually had higher amygdala activity at baseline. But they not only had higher amygdala activity at baseline, they also had higher activity in the bone marrow, which Twackle was suggesting was associated with increased inflammatory activity in the bone marrow. So the brain was driving increased inflammation in the bone marrow and increased inflammatory signaling in the aorta of the heart. So you see this linkage between brain driving the immune system in the bone marrow and immune system driving inflammation in the heart. And this just shows you results from his study in which he found that amygdala activation actually predicted the onset of cardiovascular disease, and this was mediated by arterial inflammation and bone marrow activity. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, well, can this prefrontal cortex, can this central executive network actually protect people from the heart consequences of stress? And this was using the same sample that I just discussed from Greg's study with 217 youth who are exposed to differential levels of violence. I will emphasize that even though heart attacks occur in people in 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, the earlier onset of those risk factors actually often occur early in childhood. Where people develop metabolic syndromes and cardiometabolic conditions very early in childhood that may put them at risk for the onset of heart attacks later on down the road. And so like we did before, we binned people up, we binned participants based on whether or not they had high versus low central executive network activity. Again, high here is a good thing. You want high central executive network activity. And like inflammation, we found the same pattern, such that if you're living in a low violence neighborhood, your central executive network has very little effect on metrics that are associated with metabolic syndrome and risk for heart attack, like insulin resistance. By contrast, if you're living in a high stressful environment, in this case, high murder, plus you're having a weaker profile of activity in the central executive network, you're at heightened risk for having insulin resistance. And this was observed across multiple metrics of cardiometabolic risk and metabolic syndrome that, again, in children wouldn't necessarily be associated with illness, but over time when chronic would actually result in heightened risk for a host of cardiovascular illnesses and other types of cardiometabolic conditions. So this is again suggesting that this heightened activity in the prefrontal cortex might actually help protect people from stress. We were excited that this work got some coverage in the New York Times, and the reason I'm posting this particular snip here is the question is, how is it that people become more resilient? How is it that you develop a prefrontal cortex that might help protect you from stress in your particular life circumstances. And what I just want to close with 2 or 3 slides on this point, which is that the more I learn about biology, the more I appreciate it's a malleable system. Biology is designed to change in response to experience. I think the idea that biology is destiny is questionable. There's a lot of evidence that biology is meant to change in response to experience. And one mechanism that appears to really help protect children's biology from stressful situations in their environment is actually the parental environment with which they're finding themselves in. So if people are growing and children are growing up in poverty, but they find themselves in a family with elevated supportive parenting, or parenting that involves high sensitivity and emotional support, that's been actually shown to help protect children from the consequences of poverty. This has been shown in inflammatory research and gene expression research, et cetera, that if you're having a parent that is nurturing and supportive, even if you're living in a high stressful, early adverse environment, this is very protective for your biology. And so this just shows you some research that Greg and Edith have done on this topic. So if, again, what you see here is parental education. And if you're living in a fairly wealthy environment, maternal nurturance doesn't have that large of effect. If you're living in a poor environment with a nurturing mother, in this case, the outcome variable is metabolic syndrome, which again is associated with risk for cardiovascular problems, you're pretty well protected. But if you're in a poverty-related environment plus low maternal nurturance, you've got harsh parenting plus early adversity, that's a real risk factor for cardiometabolic syndrome here. Edith, in another really nice study, showed, and this is a complex slide, I just want to highlight the fact that this also helps actually protect gene expression pathways associated with inflammation. So the point that I'm making here is that if you're in an early adverse environment as a child, but you have a supportive parent, you're actually quite protected from the deleterious effects of that environment on your health. So we did a study with Gene Brody at the University of Georgia, in which individuals who were adults were scanned, and these individuals were exposed to a real diversity of poverty and life experiences and early adversity. And what we're studying is we're studying here, how does the maternal nurturing effect of that person's childhood actually affect their brains at age 25? And so we also studied the central executive network, which is the strength of the prefrontal cortex. So what we have here is we have years in poverty. Again, this is the years spent in poverty as a child. This is just highlighting the fact that these effects linger into adulthood because the scans are on adults, but we're studying what their life was like when they were growing up. And so what you can see here is that if you've spent a lot of years in poverty as a child and you have a fairly low supportive parent, you have decreased central executive network activity. By contrast, if you're living in poverty, but you have high supportive parenting, there's really no effect of poverty on your brain, at least in terms of the central executive network, suggesting that maternal nurturance can actually help protect the brain, the immune system, and risk for health problems from the deleterious effects of poverty. And I'm excited to say that a number of us, Greg, Edith, Tom McDade, myself, and Gene Brody at the University of Georgia have just received a P50 Center of Excellence grants from NIDA to really take this to scale and examine, can we examine the effect of interventions that are actually designed to increase supportive parenting on the brains and bodies of children who are living in an adverse situation, and see, can you actually increase this kind of resiliency profile and increase the positive effects of this on the body and the brain. So just to summarize my talk, the theme of this talk was, how is it that stress gets under the skin? We know that poverty exists, and we know that poverty has a deleterious or negative effect on people's brains and their immune system. And then over time, this can create a dysregulation between the brain and the immune system that then can have negative effects for mental and physical health problems and create or be part of the pathway for how health disparities can embed themselves in our biology. We discussed how resiliency can actually help protect people from this, and we focused on brain systems involved in threat and involved in the prefrontal regulatory systems. But I'd like to kind of end my talk with the recognition that none of this work would be needed if we changed society. If we created policies that really helped reduce the amount of disparities in our country. And this for me really has been, one of the major effects that IPR has had on my thinking is this intersection between policy and biology. And so when I think of all of the wonderful work that you all are doing in IPR, discussing and focusing on poverty, or examining the effect of school funding on outcome, or work on SNAP and food insecurity, or Sarah Young's work on water insecurity, or research on racial discrimination, et cetera. All of this is actually designed to help prevent these neuroimmune dysregulation mechanisms, because the neuroimmune dysregulation mechanisms is really in part a response to the disparities that exist in society. And so I just like to say how, kind of appreciative of I am, and really inspired by all the work that all you are doing at the policy and the social level to focus on mitigating these issues. So with that, I'd just like to thank my collaborators, with particular thanks to Greg and Edith, as well as Jean Brody at the University of Georgia, and happy to take questions.